Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast.
This is an essay
About regret, but not the version you're used to. Not the regret that bruises you in the middle of the night with what you should have said. Not the regret that performs itself into apology or swallows itself into silence. This is something else, fidelity, as something that returns. Not to punish you, but to remind you that something mattered, even if it's too late. Even if it slipped through your hands before you had the language to name it. Here, regret is not treated as weakness. It is not a pathology to be cured or a blemish to be scrubbed out of your narrative. It's a signal, a trace, a form of moral attention that arrives late, but never randomly. This essay doesn't offer relief, it offers structure, a loop, 6 principles that don't cancel your pain, but give it shape, a rhythm for staying close to what you couldn't hold in time. It doesn't want your resolution, it wants your willingness to stay near what still aches, not to fix it, but to refuse abandoning it. This essay is not about closure, it's about companioning the wound, listening for what it still wants to teach you, and letting that teaching become a way of moving through the world with more care, not more certainty. There will be no release, but there may be rhythm, there may be return, and in that return, not freedom, but coherence. A way of carrying the thing that once carried you out of alignment and now just wants to be held differently. It usually starts with a sentence. Sometimes you say it, sometimes you hear it. I should have known better. I didn't mean to. If I could go back, but the beginning is never the sentence. It's earlier, quieter, a moment that doesn't quite land, a silence that follows too long after an action, a pause in the body where the mind tries to catch up. It doesn't register as failure, not yet, only as dissonance, like something meaningful just passed by unclaimed. Like a small misalignment in the rhythm of self. That's the signal, the first sign that regret is forming, not as emotion, not as punishment, but as perception. The body's ethical intelligence surfacing before the language arrives. This is the origin. Regret as moral awareness, the recognition that something in the action didn't match something in the intention. Not a collapse, not a flaw, a signal. But we're not taught to trust that signal. We're taught to move on, to justify, to optimize, to protect the narrative. Regret in that framing is weakness, a failure to be decisive, a failure to make peace with the cost. And so we exile it, we push it aside or dress it up in meaning, but the signal doesn't leave, it waits. It waits for us to stop performing clarity. It waits for us to admit that part of us still feels unresolved. It waits for us to recognize that we haven't failed. We've noticed, and noticing is the beginning of repair. That's what this first principle restores. Regret isn't a flaw in cognition, it's fidelity in perception. It shows you where your values were present too late. It doesn't say you were wrong, it says you cared. That's the difference. Regret is not proof that something broke, it's proof that something mattered. And the reason it hurts isn't because you failed, it's because part of you still wants to live by what you missed. Regret cannot exist without time. It needs sequence, it needs before and after. It needs the moment something happened and the space to realize what it meant. But time doesn't just move forward, it loops. Not in chronology, but in attention. You return to that moment, not to relive it, but to listen again, to test its weight, to ask what you missed. This is the structure regret requires. Time that moves in one direction, meaning that does not. The past can't be undone. But it can be re-understood, and in that re-understanding, the pain doesn't disappear, but it begins to clarify. We're told to move on, to keep going, but regret resists that. It doesn't follow the arc of resolution. It waits for revision. Time, in this way, becomes both the cause and the context. Regret forms when you finally become the person who can see what the earlier version of you couldn't. And that sight doesn't collapse the timeline, it expands it. It says the moment is gone, but your relationship to it isn't. This is what makes regret so difficult. It confronts us with the irreversibility of what happened, but also with the open-endedness of what it still means. You can't change the facts, but you can change the framing. And that isn't indulgent, it's ethical. It's the process of meeting the past again with more care than you had the first time. Regret asks, what didn't I understand then that I can stand beside now? What meaning was waiting for me on the far side of that moment? This is not rumination, it's revision. Not to rewrite the story, but to reread it with your full self present. Time closes the door, but it also hands you the key to what's still unfolding inside. The event is over, but your presence with it isn't. Regret, then, becomes not just a response to the past, but a commitment to carry time differently. Regret isn't just about what happened, it's about who you thought you were when it did, and what that moment did to the story you'd been telling about yourself. We don't regret facts, we regret fractures, disruptions in the sense of self that once held. The rupture isn't just in the timeline, it's in the identity. You believed you were kind. Then you watched yourself withhold softness. You believed you were brave. Then you watched yourself stay silent. And the regret that forms isn't only about the act. It's about the dissonance between the person you were trying to become and the version of you that showed up. This is why regret lingers, because it interrupts more than the narrative. It interrupts the self. It plants doubt in the continuity of who you are. That's the cost of moral intelligence. When the signal is clear, it doesn't just point backward. It asks, what does this say about me? Am I still who I thought I was? Was I ever? And the temptation is to resolve that tension quickly, to declare a new identity, to explain the fracture, to reclaim the plot. But the self isn't a clean arc, it's a body of edits, and regret is part of that editing process. Not to shame you, to reintroduce you. You're not who you were before that moment, but you're not only who you were in it either. You are the one who returned, the one who stayed with the fracture long enough to feel what it meant, to name it, to carry it, and this too becomes part of identity, not as flaw, but as texture, as the trace of someone trying to live with integrity in a world that doesn't always reward it. Regret reshapes the self, not as punishment, but as path. Not to redefine you, but to include what had been left out. You can't go back and become the version of yourself you were aiming for, but you can become the one who learned how to hold what that version abandoned. That, too, is authorship. That, too, is coherence, even if the plot never smooths out. Eventually, awareness reaches its edge. You've seen the moment, felt the rupture, traced its path through time and self. But it remains, not as confusion now, but as presence. And presence needs language, not explanation, not analysis, naming. Naming is where the interior becomes relational, where the unspeakable begins to enter form, not to be judged, but to be held, where regret becomes not just an echo, but an utterance. It becomes real in a different register. But naming isn't a solution, it's a risk. Once you name the regret, you give it shape, you give it context, history, maybe even responsibility. You admit it matters. You let it surface in language that might not be clean. You say, this happened, this is still happening in me. We hope naming will end it. That language will tame the pain. But naming doesn't remove, it repositions. It lets regret move from silent loop to spoken fragment. And in that movement, something in you loosens. Not gone, not fixed, just no longer hidden. But not all naming is repair. Sometimes naming becomes performance, a way to appear vulnerable without being open, a way to control the meaning before it can breathe. So the ethic here is subtle. Name the regret, but not to tidy it. Name it like you'd speak to a wound you're willing to keep cleaning. Name it not to be seen, but to stay in relationship with what mattered. This might look like a sentence said only once, or a phrase whispered with no one listening, or a line written on paper you later burn. It might be nothing but an internal nod to the self you once turned away from. But in the act of naming, something changes. Not the past, but your posture toward it. You begin to carry the regret not as weight, but as witness. It walks beside you now, not behind you, not interrupting, not dominating. Just present, seen, spoken. That's the work. To let what once couldn't be named find its way into your mouth, and to say it, not because it changes the story, but because it changes your ability to remain inside it. Even naming doesn't bring closure, it brings clarity. And clarity invites something else, something slower, harder to name, a kind of nearness, not comfort, not peace, just the willingness to remain. This is where ritual begins, not as performance, not as solution, as a shape for staying close to what can't be fixed. We often imagine that once we understand, the pain will lessen, that once we name it, we'll be free. But regret doesn't obey that logic. It doesn't shrink under attention. It deepens. It settles. It waits for your hands to stop trying to fix it and simply hold it instead. Ritual is how that holding takes form. You light the same candle, you say the same phrase, you pause when the memory returns, not to chase it away but to make space. You don't perform it, you accompany it, and in that repetition something opens. Not a solution, a rhythm. Not all days ask for ritual, but when it comes, it knows. It brings its own timing, its own breath. You meet it the way you'd meet a friend who never left, only changed shape. There's a part of it you still can't say. That's part of the ritual too. You carry it to the edge of language, you sit beside it, you leave space. Some days it will feel like devotion, other days it will feel like failure. That too is part of the practice. You return. Again, not healed, not whole, just willing. And that willingness, that refusal to abandon the wound or disguise its depth, that becomes your integrity. Not because you resolved the pain, but because you remained near it, long enough for it to stop needing to be erased, long enough for it to teach you how to stay. Even with rituals, something remains unresolved, a silence beneath the silence, a discomfort that doesn't belong entirely to you, and slowly you begin to see it. The regret didn't start with you. It didn't end with you either. This is the moment regret stops feeling purely personal. You notice the structures around it, the pressures, the patterns, the way you were taught to endure instead of speak, to shrink instead of shift, to call it your choice when no other option was safe. You regret staying quiet. But who punished you when you first spoke? You regret leaving too late. But who convinced you leaving meant failure? You regret not knowing, but who told you ignorance was virtue? Regret becomes a map. It shows where your own actions collided with a world that trained you to disappear. It reveals not just a lapse in judgment, but the architecture of expectation that shaped it. This isn't a way out of accountability. It's a way into context. You're not escaping responsibility. You're refusing to bear it alone. Because regret often names the place where private pain mirrors public pattern. The part of your life shaped by forces you didn't choose, cultural scripts, institutional silences, inherited myths about what makes you good or strong or worthy. And when you see that, the weight shifts, not away, just more honestly. You begin to ask, what parts of this regret were mine to carry? And what parts were the cost of surviving a system that asked me to abandon myself? This is where compassion enters, not just for yourself, but for others lost in the same design. You start recognizing their regrets, not as weakness, but as signals, not as pathology, but as testimony. Proof that they too were trying to remain intact inside something that was never neutral. And suddenly, the work changes. It's no longer about repairing one moment. It's about disrupting the conditions that made that moment inevitable. You carry your regret forward, not just as memory, but as resistance. Because once you see the pattern, you can name it. And once you name it, you're no longer only its product. You become a force inside it, still shaped by it, but no longer silently consenting. It doesn't reset, it returns. But the loop is different now. It's not circling the same pain. It's tracing the shape of how you've changed. Not healed, not freed, but altered, accompanied. You feel regret again, not as collapse, as recognition. A quiet pulse that says, I know what this is, I've been here before. And this time you stay, you don't flinch, you don't rush to name it, you just let it stand beside you. You remember when it began, not the event, but the signal. The moment you first notice the misalignment, you don't erase it now, you revisit it, not to judge, but to listen, to ask, what else have you been trying to show me? You trace who it affected, the person you were trying to become, the self who disappeared in that moment, and the version of you that finally came back for them. You name it again, but gently now. No performance, no urgency, just presence, a phrase spoken under your breath, a ritual remembered without effort. You carry it differently. It's not a weight, it's a rhythm, a part of how you move, how you choose, how you stay close to your own values. It doesn't dominate you, it walks beside you, sometimes ahead, sometimes quiet, but never gone. And you see it more clearly now, the structure around it, the forces that shaped it. You no longer confuse responsibility with isolation. You can say, this was mine, and this was given to me before I knew how to say no. The loop holds, not as trap, as memory system, as a form of ethical continuity. You don't ask, how do I get rid of this? You ask, what does this regret still want me to know? And that question no longer wounds you. It steadies you. It reminds you that you are still in relationship with what mattered, not because you failed, because you refused to forget. The loop isn't punishment, it's fidelity, a way of staying near the parts of you that still deserve to be heard. There's no final line, just return, not to the beginning, but to the place in you that stayed open. Regret doesn't finish, it folds, it becomes part of the architecture of how you remember, how you choose, how you remain. You thought the goal was to heal it, to reach some clean horizon where the ache no longer arrived. But now you know the ache isn't the problem. The ache is the form love takes when it's been delayed. And regret is how that love returns, not to be resolved, but to be received. This is what it means to carry it differently. Not to forgive yourself so cleanly that nothing remains. Not to build a narrative so sturdy that you no longer feel. But to make space for the parts of you that still remember what mattered, even when you couldn't protect it. Even when you were too young, too scared, too small. Regret is what keeps the past from flattening. It's what keeps you honest. It's what lets you feel the shape of your own becoming. Not as perfection, as attempt, as the trace of values you didn't know how to live, but never truly abandoned. You don't need to go back, you don't need to rewrite it, but you do need to stay near the place where it shifted you, to visit without violence, to breathe without defense. The point isn't to change the story. The point is to walk with the part of you who still lives inside it. Not forever, just honestly. Because some regrets don't ask to be forgiven. They ask to be accompanied. They ask to be named gently, to be returned to slowly, to be kept alive in a way that softens, not erases the pain. And if they still hurt, it's not because you're broken, it's because you still care. And that caring, that fidelity to what mattered, even after it slipped through your hands, that is not your weakness. That is your shape. And it will keep shaping you.